So it's time for me to change language, and our last keynote speaker of this day is going to talk about social innovation, give a retro perspective look on at the future. He is an author. He is also a pioneer within social innovation. He wrote a book a very long time ago about social innovation. He's a global advisor in innovation and in creativity, and he is going to talk about why social innovation is more important than ever, which we heard the ministers say already this morning, and how we are going to create the breakthroughs we need. Please welcome on stage Charles Leadbeater.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction, and thank you to everyone from Malmo for bringing me here. The last time I came to Malmo, I arrived by hydrofoil, and I remember people telling me about this bridge and sort of pointing to the horizon and not really believing them. And it's incredible to come back 20 years later and to find the city having gone through so much, so many challenges of losing all those jobs in dockyards and manufacturing and textile, and there was always that sort of looming shadow of Lund just up the road with its university. And this incredible story of how a group of people came together to reimagine Malmo's future and to create a university and to build a bridge and to build new buildings and to create new jobs and to create out of that, I suppose, what I think we're all kind of looking for, which is a narrative of shared progress. That's what the world lacks, a narrative of shared progress. And I think Malmo is a very good example, really, of why that narrative can never be finished. Because Malmo is unfinished, of course, because there'll be huge challenges still in creating and recreating that narrative as more people come from different places and need to create their own narrative in this place. So it's a story of incredible creativity and resilience. So it's great to be here for that reason, but it's great to be here because I'm British. And I'm just so glad to get out of Britain. It's so nice to find that people still want to talk to us. And occasionally today I've been mistaken for being Swedish, and that's a real relief, because I then think, oh, well, maybe I could get away with being Swedish in future as our country embarks on this sort of collective suicide effort called Brexit. So just to tell you a little bit about where I come from, you know, with all this Brexit stuff and sort of more boundaries, borders, retreating from the world, the government has had to introduce a kind of special dress code to make sure people know who is properly British. So at some point after Brexit, 2019, we will all dress like this. Now, this was supposed to be a sort of soap opera, but unfortunately it's become a kind of national strategy. And unfairly, I think, people say that the British government doesn't really have a strategy for Brexit. They don't know where they're headed or what they're doing, but I actually have a picture of it to show that they do know exactly what they're doing. And the trouble with Britain is that it's always kind of on the verge of just slipping into reverse, because it's more comfortable somehow going backwards than going forward. So it's very comforting for me that you would ask someone from Britain to come and talk a little bit about the future. So it's easy to dismiss all this Brexit stuff. It's easy to make a joke of it, and that's, I suppose, part of the way in which we deflect it. But the only point I would make about this stuff is that this is the competition. For us, this is the competition. Because these people are amongst the other people making sense of the world for people who feel on the wrong side of change. And these people are operating and offering a different recipe. It's a recipe of control, of division, of segregation, of polarization, of singularity, of the one pure way. And that's what we have to be against. But they are competing with us. And at the moment, actually, they're doing quite a good job. The gangs that might run some of the estates around Malmö, they're competing with us as well because they have a story of control, of singularity, of closure, of belonging. So with people looking for those stories, it's very important that we realize the significance of the context that we work in. And our competition is all around, but it doesn't look like us. It won't come talking our language. I've had such a brilliant day today. I have so many fantastic conversations, young, energetic people doing amazing things. I sat in an entire workshop run by Tio in which he got people to make paper planes and then deliberately screwed them up in front of them, and then they applauded him, and it was absolutely wonderful. I haven't understood a single word all day. I haven't understood a single thing. And so it's a great pleasure to have that. I mean, that's why we go abroad, because people we can't understand are so much more interesting than people we can understand. So it's been great in that sense, but I think I should probably get to know you a little bit. I should probably find out a little bit about who you are and what you believe in and what you're interested in. So I'm just going to very quickly show you these symbols. And I'm going to ask you to look at them, and I'm going to ask you to think. Imagine if the entire room was brought back to life, reincarnated as a symbol, and you had to choose a symbol to express who you were, your identity and character. So I'm just going to ask you to look at the symbols and think, which of these symbols would best express me? And in a second, I'm going to ask you to put up your hands to tell me. There's only, well, two rules. One rule is that you have to put up your hand, because if you don't, you've got no personality, and that would be a slur on the Swedish. And the second is you can put your hand up twice, but that means you're schizophrenic, and someone will come in and take you away. Okay? So who would identify themselves as a square? Is there one person in the room? Oh, there's someone right at the back, I think, was waving their hand. Was there? Not a single person identifies themselves as a square, as far as I can see. There is one person, I think, who did put up there. Oh, yes, at the back. One person. American psychologists have found by testing these symbols on thousands of people that the person who identifies with this square is the most intelligent person in any room. So who identifies with the triangle pointing? Oh gosh, quite a few people. Not that many, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. About, I don't know, 15 or something like that. So watch out for these people later, because these people identify with that shape because they're very ambitious. They're headed to the top. They think in terms of hierarchies and pyramids. They're not very bright, but they are very, very ambitious. Who thinks of themselves as a sort of addition sign? Oh, quite a lot of people. I would say, not half the room, but sort of 20 or 30, maybe even 40 people. So these people are very creative. They bring things together, they add up, they add things together. Their career's in a bit of a mess, but they are at least creative. And finally, who identifies themselves as a circle? Oh, good Lord, half the room. Just keep your hands up and look around at yourselves. Circles, just clock yourselves, right? Half the room. American psychologists have found, by testing these symbols on thousands of people over several decades, that people who identify with the circle are obsessed by sex and drink. So you can test that out later. So in the introduction to my talk, you mentioned that I had written this thing a long, long time ago. 1997, I wrote this thing called The Rise of the Social Entrepreneur. I'd just become self-employed. I had decided that I'd had enough of having a title and working in a big organization, and I was literally going to start working from my desk in my bedroom, clearing up my dirty laundry every day before I could start work. And this bunch of people came to me and said, we're social entrepreneurs, but we don't really know what that means. We'd like you to tell us what it might mean. And it was a fantastic opportunity because no one had written anything about social entrepreneurship. There was one other report that came out about the same time, and so there was nothing to read. There was no books, there were no references, there was no endless list of, for a bibliography. So I just sort of worked with these people and thought nothing more of it, really. There were a few people like Marcello and others, Triodos, who were in this space already. There were little hints, but there were no social impact funds. There was no SRIOI or whatever it is. There were no schools for social entrepreneurs, no graduate programs, no incubators, no hubs and no labs, and so on and so forth. And I suppose the only thing that all I can do, the only thing I know how to do, so I keep on doing it, is to write things and come up with ideas, is that if you can find the right idea at the right time, and it helps people articulate who they are and what they're trying to do, it can kind of have a certain sort of traction and it can enjoy a certain sort of purchase. And that, I think, is then what happened. That led me then over a long period of time to be interested in both social entrepreneurship and social innovation. And I suppose the answer to the question, what is social innovation for, which was provided by that report, The Rise of the Social Entrepreneur, was that social entrepreneurship and innovation was about solving problems. And in particular, it was about solving problems that other people weren't interested in, that the market didn't show an interest in because there wasn't enough money to be made, that the government didn't show an interest in because the voters weren't powerful enough, charity wasn't the right solution. And so social entrepreneurs emerged in this space in between all these other systems, solving things that were systematically overlooked by other people because they had no interest in addressing them. And so it was very much about filling in gaps, providing solutions that other people couldn't provide. I suppose the two really big things that I've learned since writing that and which keep coming back to me, which is I know so many people who are good at starting things, small things, inspiring things. I know quite a lot of people who are good at running things, big things. I know very, very few people who are good at going between the two, who are really good at growing things and spreading things and scaling and developing things. And so the biggest sort of remaining question, which is how do you achieve impact at scale to change entire systems rather than having inspiring but ill-fated and doomed experiments. I've been involved in so many of those that my tombstone will say, Charlie Leadbeater, interesting but irrelevant, basically, because I've done so many things which have been interesting but ultimately irrelevant. And the question that keeps coming back then for us and this community that you're growing is this: if we are doing so much amazing work, why is everything quite so shit? That is the question. If we are busy working away, creating our new solutions, launching our social enterprises, why is it that society becomes more unequal, less democratic, and more environmentally destructive? And so the danger is that we do more work that we think is great, but actually its impact on the world is very tenuous. And really, why we're doing this is that we all like getting together. We all like being with one another, whereas actually we have to be with people we don't like, or we can't persuade, or who don't see the world our way. So that then leads to the second question, which is, well, who does it? And the answer in The Rise of the Social Entrepreneur was that who does it were quite extraordinary, dynamic, charismatic individuals who could organize all sorts of people around them. And the longer I've been in this, the more frustrated I've become with many of those people. And the more I think it's about people who do have dynamism and charisma, but they come in teams, they build communities, coalitions, and movements. They're incredibly generous and they're incredibly humble in many ways. The most impressive are the least aggressive in terms of promoting themselves. But it's got to not be a special thing. It's got to move from being a special thing to almost being an ordinary thing. We've got to make it unspecial if it's going to be successful. And the question of what it's for now is, of course, defined by this, that the status quo just doesn't work anymore. It's not worth defending because the economic status quo delivers inequality, insecurity, slow growth, environmental degradation, climate change, instability in people's lives, and underlying that leads to this breakdown of trust in established institutions, elites, and models. People are fleeing democracy in some bizarre way, or they're certainly fleeing the political mainstream, which no longer seems to deliver for them in a world dominated by forces which seem out of their control. There's a breakdown of trust in community and institutions of community. And so there is, underlying all of this, a kind of loss of a shared narrative of progress, because if we can no longer really believe in the narrative of a democratic community because democracy is failing and political parties seem to be self-serving and democracy can exert no influence on the world, and if we find it harder to believe in notions of community because societies become more unequal or more diverse or been stretched to breaking point, and if the economic model that to live well is to have material well-being, but actually the economy is stagnating for most people and it doesn't feel like that, then we lose this sense of shared narrative, and then that opens the space for populism, nationalism, and all those other things that come flooding in to divide people, separate them, and set them against one another. So now, what social innovation is for is, I think, to create these new sources of shared progress. This hope that progress can be shared, can be understood as a kind of shared undertaking, and that we can break through that. That in the midst of all the breakdowns of institutions, models, organizations, so on and so forth, out of that chaos comes this enormous energy which you can channel into breakthroughs. That's what I hope we are now in the midst of. But it's going to be a really alarming and upsetting, by which I mean upsetting and exciting at the same time. If you combine the two words, upsetting and exciting, what you get is upsighting. And the world, it seems to me, is a very upsighting place. And so what I think social innovation needs to do is create these breakthroughs where you can go through a period of turmoil and break through to a new kind of order. Where do those come from? What does it take to break through to a new shared narrative of progress? Well, let me just give you one example of that. And from that example, try and derive some general lessons. And it's the story of the pill. The contraceptive pill, which for me is one of the most significant social innovations of the last 60, 70 years, in which it came about by people reimagining the most basic aspects of life. So this is important because it's touching something that was so vital and concerns so many people, and where the fates for women, the outlook, the prospects for women were so utterly dreadful and unfair and unforgiving. So the people who set out to create the pill knew that they were attacking something that needed to be reimagined. And they did that by imagining it without something. How could you have sex without the risk of being pregnant? And in the process, they created a huge opportunity, which was to reimagine what life could be if you took that risk away. So it was this sort of double thing that they thought, how could you do it without that, and in the process create some new range of possibilities that weren't there before? So if you want to have a breakthrough, you have to think about without. You have to take really big things and imagine how you could do it without something else. So imagine cars without cities, cities without cars. It's really easy now, I think, to imagine cities without combustion engines. I think it's obviously every day we use money without cash. But I think it's quite possible to imagine now an economy without money. It's certainly possible to imagine money without banks. All of us every day probably do shopping without shops. I think it's perfectly possible to imagine packaging without plastic or energy without carbon. All of these things become possible. And so really radical innovators, it seems to me, ask these without questions. Could you imagine a future of energy without carbon? Or food without soil? Or some people would say meat without cattle. These without questions, they're very troubling, but in the process you can generate all sorts of possibilities that weren't there before. How did that happen with the pill? Well, it started with this absolutely incredible woman, Margaret Sanger. She was, from an early age, the most ardent, fervent, articulate exponent of free love America has ever seen. She grew up spending time in Greenwich Village, but also in Europe. And from a very early age, she set up Planned Parenthood. She opened the first birth control and birth advice clinic in America that was promptly closed down by the police, and she was thrown in prison. That was in 1916. And over the next 40-odd years, she continued to pursue this dream that she had even from that age, which was, what if women could be freed from the risks of pregnancy that condemned so many to lives they didn't want to lead? And she kept on pursuing it. In 1950, at a party in New York, she met this man, Gregory Pincus. Pincus was the world's leading expert in mammalian reproduction. And because he was a maverick and didn't play by the rules, he'd been kicked out of Harvard because he'd gone too far, the authorities thought, in experimenting with artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization. So he found himself looking for work. He was an outsider, a kind of scientific entrepreneur, and he was up for challenges. So when Sanger met him and said, could you, do you think, create a pill, a simple pill that women would take and it would stop them getting pregnant, Pincus said, yes, of course I could. Didn't know how he was going to do it, but he said he could. Sanger gave him $2,000. That's what he started with. The third person who came in was this remarkable woman, Catherine McKinnon. She was the first woman to graduate with a science degree from MIT. After leaving MIT, she married the son of a combine harvester fortune who was a schizophrenic. She spent 35 years looking after him, but when he, Cyrus McKinnon, died, she inherited her fortune and decided that she was going to invest it, or large chunks of it, in Pincus and Sanger. So McKinnon would now be known as a venture philanthropist or an impact investor, but that term hadn't been invented. And the final person was a really important person who's often lacking, in my experience, in social innovation stories. It was this man called J.D. Rock. J.D. Rock was a gynecologist. He was one of the leading gynecologists in America, and he was frustrated and upset and had enough of dealing with and helping women who didn't want to be pregnant. And his concern was mainly medical. The significance of Rock was, just look at him. He does not look like a social entrepreneur. And that's because he wasn't. That's because he was a deeply conservative person. And if you wanted to persuade other deeply conservative people, for instance in the Catholic Church, to come that way, to not oppose them, you needed someone like Rock who would reach over that divide. It was Rock who sold the idea of the pill to most of the medical community. So this team, this group of 4, came together over a decade in the 50s. And one of the places they worked in, this is where Pincus did most of his research, in a converted old ladies' home in Worcester, Massachusetts, which was a ramshackle place. It was not a scientific lab, but this is where the pill was made, by that incredible, eclectic team coming together, and they produced this as one of its first sort of iterations, and it became this. Within months, millions of women were using it, and the pill went on to change society in all sorts of ways. What does it take to create breakthroughs like that, where you change society with an innovation of that power? Well, I think it takes 4 things that come together to create a 5th, and these are the 4. First of all, it takes thinking, breakthrough thinking. And breakthrough thinking is exactly that. It is thinking. Now, that's a problem for social entrepreneurs because they don't like to think, in my experience. They like to do, but they're a bit dismissive of thinking. But actually, the preconditions for a lot of social entrepreneurship are people who think, who question, who challenge, but also who dream and create. And that combination of critiquing and criticizing reality, but also imagining a better world, that's quite a difficult combination to get together. Sanger had it, but not many people have it. So that's why places like this lab in Worcester are so important, because you get this combination of people who are both critical and creative at the same time, mixing disciplines, which is why I say it's transgressive. Because actually, if you want to innovate, you've got to cross some boundaries to get out of your echo chamber or your discipline and engage with people who are not like you and indeed who may disagree with you. So breakthrough thinking is, I think, unabashedly utopian. It is raising possibilities of better ways to live that don't currently exist, and it's using those to critique existing reality. I think you're blessed in Malmö to have a new university, because my experience is that universities are the last place to get breakthrough thinking, because universities are divided into competing disciplines and hierarchies that don't encourage that, nor do our education systems, which is why breakthrough thinking often comes from people who are marginal, who are outside the mainstream, who think and work and look and act in different kinds of ways. But we need more breakthrough thinking. We need more breakthrough thinking which is utopian and critical at the same time. The second thing is, with the pill, the idea was turned into a tool, a piece of technology. And I think all innovation needs to be realized in some form that can be organized around. And in that sense, it needs to be a technology. It doesn't need to be a pill or a tool. It could be a piece of software or a method. But it's got to be something that creates a sort of step change in how people can do things, which is relatively concrete. So you've got to do that, you have to have people who are interested in that realization, that translating ideas into concrete practice. That's a really nuts and bolts job much of the time. The guy who did most of the testing on the pill was a Chinese-American chemist called M.C. Chang, who worked in the basements, who got very little recognition from it. But you would need then to add to the community people like him who can do this kind of stuff. The third thing is you need organizations which break through, which break the mold of traditional organizations. So in the case of the pill, Planned Parenthood a new kind of organization that was campaigning, serving, funding. The research organization at Worcester was adopted in a new kind of way, and then the scaling and spreading of the innovation took organizational innovation as well. So you need people who are prepared to be organized, but organized in new ways. And finally, you need breakthrough culture, by which I mean you need the innovation to be pulled by people who aspire to it. So you need to think about the demand side and whether it's ready. And actually, the breakthrough culture that pulled the pill out into the market was, of course, the culture which led to the thinking that led to the critique and the imagining. So the culture was playing it, if you like, in both ways. So the pill was licensed for use the day before. Lady Chatterley's Lover was a license for publication in the United States. It came just as the baby boomers were taking off. It came just before Elvis and the Beatles. In other words, it arrived just at the right moment to articulate this movement of social change. And that is when innovation really takes off, when it becomes a movement. When you get this movement of ideas, technology, organization, culture, which leads to a kind of momentum that creates its own kind of scale and finds its own flow of resources to push it through. I think innovation like this invariably starts with teams, with a diversity of people. They create around them a wider community, but it needs to become about coalitions and movements. And what we need are more breakthrough coalitions and movements. So this is, if you like, the cycle of that thing. And you could start in any one of these different places. You could start with technology and it might go back to ideas and thinking, or you could start with technology and organization and it would go back to thinking, or thinking might be the inspiration. When the Dutch decided to start drinking clean water in the 19th century, rather than drinking water that was stagnant in lakes and ponds, when they created systems for clean water, they did it for all sorts of reasons, but they didn't do it because it made them healthy. What they discovered was it made them healthy, and then the water system became attached to a set of ideas about the importance of public health, which came after the invention of the technology. So it may be that it works that way, but some combination of this needs to happen for an innovation to gain the momentum to become a real breakthrough. So my experience, I suppose, of working with social entrepreneurs and innovators all over the world is that the most impressive build and lead movements. So I'll give you the most impressive that I've ever met, a man called Madhav Chavan, who set up an organization in India called Pratam. Madhav wanted to create a way to provide preschool education to very poor children. Lots of research shows that if you can provide preschool education, children stay on at school longer and get better outcomes. But preschool is beyond the means of most Indian parents. So Madhav picked up an innovation created at Mumbai University by a professor of sociology, and he was an organizer. He was a trade union organizer. His background was in getting big membership drives, and he applied that logic to this innovation. And within 6 months, he'd organized 3,000 low-cost preschool playgroups. And he did it by doing without. And he said, I'm not going to employ anyone. I'm not going to own any premises. What I am going to do is to find a way to train young women so that they can start preschool playgroups in their own homes and provide them with support and materials. And this was his price point, $10 a year. That's doing without. When you operate with that kind of constraint, you have to think radically. And then he had to build a movement. Now Pratam teaches 21 million children a year in India, all through this kind of movement. So if you want to be a really successful social entrepreneur and social innovator, if you want to create breakthrough change, my bottom line message would be this, is that movements make markets. If you want to change and shape markets of any kind, you have to create a movement. And you have to think and act as if you're creating a movement. That's where big change really comes from. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lesson in creating movements. It's really interesting, and I think we have some work to do. Let me ask you, I read a couple of interviews with you, and you described in one interview that you don't think, you need a lot of change, you need powerful movements to get these breakthroughs, and you don't see enough of change. Is that right?
Well, I don't see enough impact, I suppose, is what I don't see. So I see a lot of change. You can have a lot of change, but the question is whether it's generating impact and improvement, I suppose. But what I don't think we yet have enough of is people are being prepared to ask those really big questions about how society should be organized, which in a way, the populist right is asking now.
So you think the populists are asking kind of...
Well, they're prepared to ask about nation, borders, belonging, identity, all these sorts of things, I suppose. And if we're providing useful little improvements here and there, we are not matching the sort of, I think we're not yet matching the scale of people's appetite to think differently about how the world might be organized. That's the big thing.
And that's why the populists gain votes.
Well, I think it's one reason why, yeah. I think it's that they are prepared to ask, some of them are prepared to ask questions about meaning, belonging, community, identity, not just money. So Brexit, the reason the Remainers lost Brexit was that it was an absolutely miserable, materialistic, instrumental campaign, which was if you vote for Brexit, you'll lose £4,000. Well, if you don't have any money anyway, because you're living on benefits, you've got no job and you're going nowhere, being threatened that you're going to lose £4,000 is not any kind of incentive to vote. Whereas instead, they were being told, take back control. Well, control is a big, powerful word. It's called birth control because it gives people a sense of control.
So what should we do to turn this around?
Well, I think you've got to be more ambitious. You've got to ask bigger questions. You've got to have confidence in what you're doing. But the critical thing is you have to not just talk to yourselves. And that's the sort of danger with nascent communities of social innovators, is that we all get together and we talk to one another, and actually we've got to step out into a world where people don't really understand us, they're not really interested in us, we seem a bit complicated and so on and so forth, and it's got to really kind of make sense. So I'm not a believer in the private sector, by and large, having answers, but I think if you could get something, if you could imagine going to social innovation sources being like going to IKEA, I mean, what would it be like if social innovation was written into life in the way that going to IKEA was written? Do you see what I mean? It was a sort of everyday activity. Or we produce things which were as everyday as that. That, I think, would then mean we were reaching real scale.
Because you also said in this interview that I read that you don't feel that social innovators are doing enough coalitions, that they're quite individualistic?
Yes, I think, well, I think there's partly a problem. There's two sorts of problems. One is there's a kind of psychological problem, which is if you're devoting your life to something and you're foregoing other benefits like money or reputation or titles, then I think there is an inbuilt tendency in some social entrepreneurs that I know to want to have sort of, this is mine, I'm kind of, this is me, I'm going to hang on to it. And actually the best thing with a lot of innovation is that the innovators don't hang on to it, they let it go.
Share it.
They give it to other people who will take it on. And as a result, also with a competition for funding between people, there's obviously people who might have a lot to share sometimes don't get together. So actually big change, my experience, comes from coalitions and movements.
Coalitions and sharing innovations.
Yes.
And
building momentum, though. The point about movements is that they actually, they have to move people. They are things which kind of get people emotional and want people to make change.
One other thing I read about you is that you said that the future belongs to those who conserves old systems and combines them with new solutions, instead of just rushing along into the new technology era.
No. So, no, I mean, I've written a lot and advised people a lot about disruptive innovation. The word disruption now makes me want to vomit. If anyone says to me, I'm going to be disruptive, I will just be sick. Because actually there are many, many different ways to be innovative. You can be evolutionary, transformational, generative. When the pill came along, it didn't disrupt anything. They didn't set out to disrupt condoms. They didn't say, we're going to disrupt the condom market. They set out to solve a really big challenge and in the process change the world and generate wave after wave of social change. So this is generative innovation. It's not purely disruptive. And I think that in the process of innovating now, in the 21st century, I would say quite a lot of the value of innovation is going to be about conserving what makes us human in a world awash with technology. And that will be quite old-fashioned, quite relational, quite low-tech, quite a lot of that.
So on the note of conserving old systems, let me end by a quote you said, "It's a peculiar time we're living in when holding on to old things might be radical."
Yes.
Charles Leadbeater, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.